In the final moments of Fritz Lang's Metropolis, the foreman leader of the oppressed working class shakes hands with the city's master, brought together and encouraged to find a compromise by the industrialist's son. Inherently, this image is a positively connoted one. It's designed to be. Visually, it represents the newfound unity between the two opposing sides, and within the greater context of the film, it serves as the ultimate resolution of the narrative conflict in a symbolic image. Frieder, the mediator, fulfills his destiny and wins the heart of the girl he loves, and the workers finally find an audience to share their grievances with their bosses. However, it hasn't been perceived as a positive ending in the majority of critical cinematic analysis. In Siegfried Kracauer's From Caligari to Hitler, A Psychological History of the German Film, this very same image is captioned as sham alliance between labor and capital. The actual text of the book goes no further into this analysis, representing the statement as a matter of fact. Lottie H. Eisner's The Haunted Screen, Expressionism in the German Cinema and the Influence of Max Reinhardt elaborates on the sentiment, but again refuses to defend the position as if it were an undeniable truth. Eisner writes, "The horny-handed worker's superficial reconciliation with his boorish boss, arranged by his son with the slogan, 'The heart mediating between the directing brain and the toiling hands,' comes straight from UFA and Thea von Harbo, then Lang's collaborator. Her sentimentalism and her deplorable taste for false grandeur were to make her lapse rapidly into the darkness of Nazi ideology." Regardless of Harbo's fascist sympathies, the question can still be asked. Why does this image inspire such ardent, dismissive criticism? And why is the analysis represented as the only logical conclusion? Anton Keyes is able to elaborate on this position where his fellow critics do not. In his essay, Metropolis, City, Cinema, Modernity, he writes, "Having gone into production only 6 years after the failed workers' revolution of 1918 to 1919, Metropolis is emphatically utopian in its keen desire for social harmony. While it was true that relations between the classes had become relatively stable following the hyperinflation of 1923 to 1924, the reconciliation between labor and management at the conclusion of the film still seemed like a contrived happy ending made in Hollywood. Here, the point is that the narrative conclusion is too optimistic and doesn't accurately represent the ramifications of a proletariat revolution." The criticism compares the product to Hollywood trite, as if utopian optimism was inherent proof that the film had nothing meaningful to say about the class struggle it represents. Utopian is an accurate assessment, but the analysis rules out the possibility that the convenience of the alliance is meant to draw attention to itself. In F.W. Murnau's The Last Laugh, Emil Jannings plays a doorman stripped of his extravagant uniform, the one semblance of authority that he builds his identity around. The narrative ends with the man slowly losing his grip on reality, cowered in the same restroom he is delegated to attend. Or at least, that's how the film should end, before screenwriter Karl Mayer interrupts with an intertitle describing the separation between reality and narrative. The coda shows the same man, now the recipient of a massive wealth, lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time to inherit a millionaire's riches. Arguably, the only thing that separates the ending of Metropolis with that of The Last Laugh is the presence of this title card. In many ways, the film could be utilizing the same technique not just to comment on the censorship of realistic elements, delegating cinema to a medium purely for entertainment, but also pining for a reality where this kind of reconciliation could be possible. This has been rightly criticized as contradictory, but that doesn't mean that it should inherently be discounted. Rather, it shows an interesting element of the German psyche. As Keyes explains, the much maligned ending of Metropolis, the reconciliation between capital and labor, which has been called simplistic, foolish, reactionary, and worse, is in fact an accurate expression of contradictory German responses to modernity, technological progress, and instrumental rationality. This argument is dismissed when authors like Eisner and Kracauer label the alliance of labor and capital as a superficial sham. Their position is also summed up by Keyes, describing it as the oppression with a heart analysis. At the end, the workers again march in formation and come to a stop only to watch their foreman shake hands with the ruler of the city, as the young facilitators of the social peace, Freder and Maria, look on. This argument takes into account a hypothetical future that the film does not show, one in which nothing truly changes for anyone. Instead of a lack of agreement between the upper crust and the factory dwellers, the lower classes are placated by their masters, and any compromise will always be flawed because it will be designed to maintain the class structure of the society. The hot bourgeoisie have come out on top again, halting the revolution that threatens their existence dead in its tracks. This plays on Marxist analysis, but in many ways misses a fundamental element of Karl Marx's criticisms of capitalism. Marx not only described the proletariat revolution as necessary for progress, he fervently believed that it was inevitable. This idea has been coined as both the march of history and as historical materialism. The application of these hypotheses can be seen clearly in the film in a much earlier sequence. When Freder discovers the catacombs where the workers hold their secret meetings, he walks in on Maria preaching to her brethren about the arrival of a mediator. The men are tired of waiting, actively held back from an imminent revolt by Maria, who pleads for a nonviolent compromise. Once this is achieved at the end of the film, the corporate leaders have already experienced a taste of the revolt, spurred by the charismatic and anarchistic anti-Maria android. To assume that the bosses see the mediation as an opportunity for further oppression is an interesting analysis. After all, if the compromise fails, what is stopping the working class from rising up and revolting again? This process is explained succinctly and elegantly by Khan Academy in their series of sociology videos, specifically in the lesson on conflict theory.
Marx created a model which proposed that a society where one group exploited another group economically would actually contain the seeds of its own destruction. The existing generally accepted state, or thesis, of a society would cause the formation of a reaction, or antithesis, that opposed the accepted state. The thesis and antithesis can't exist together peacefully. The struggle between the two sides would eventually lead to a compromise, or a synthesis of the two, resolving the tension between them by creating a new state. This synthesis of thesis and antithesis would eventually become a new thesis in its own right, and begin the process of creating its opposite once again. Even after this struggle is settled, there would eventually be unrest again, and an antithesis would spring from that new source of unrest and tension.
Fundamentally, for the workers, this compromise is a step in the right direction, leading towards the ideal future of democratic unity. When authors and critics interpret this scene as one that ultimately forwards capitalistic intentions and solidifies an oppressive hierarchy, they are misconstruing something. In a way, it's hard to blame them, considering what they perceive to be the authorial intent. During an interview with Peter Bogdanovich, Lang stated, "You cannot make a social conscious picture in which you say that the intermediary between the hand and the brain is the heart. I mean, that's a fairy tale, definitely." Lang also expresses further dissatisfaction with the finished product, seemingly sealing the film's fate, but Bogdanovich later suggested that a reason Lang wanted to separate himself from the work was because the National Socialist Party had taken a particular liking to it. A salient reason for this was because of Harbaugh's membership to the fascist ideology, but although some elements can be interpreted as anti-Bolshevism, there are far more oppositions to crucial Nazi tenets. Ellie Hoffman described these points in the article Fritz Lang's Monster, Was Metropolis a Pro-Nazi Film?, where she elaborates, "If one breaks through the Nazi propaganda and takes a view of the situation that had developed in Germany objectively, it becomes clear that Hitler had far more in common with Joe Fredersen than with his son. The Nazis, more often than not, made things easier for the working class only in comparison to the horrible conditions of 1932, rather than the relative prosperity the workers enjoyed in 1929. Far from trying to give the workers more representation, the Nazis shut down and seized the offices of labor and trade unions within Germany. And while the workers, German and foreigner alike, toiled, the Nazi elite embodied the bourgeoisie, cuddling up to big business, even in spite of their proclamations of their intent to make large industries share the profits." This comparison of Hitler to the industrialist master exploiting the working class is apt, despite what the man may have thought of it himself. Fundamentally, the Nazis were not true socialists, and used the National Socialist euphemism to mask their true intentions, as Hoffman writes, giving the lower classes the illusion of the possibility of a better life without delivering. In Metropolis, as in Marxism, this better life for the proletariat is not only a possibility, it is an inevitability. Freder's arrival as the mediator can be seen as the spiritualistic Son of God walking amongst the common people, but it can just as easily be seen as the fulfillment of a socialist destiny. When Freder appears, he signals a revolution not in the violent and forcible overthrow of the government that the anti-Maria attempts to ignite, but rather a non-violent upheaval of failing ideals. This concept of nonviolent resistance was not alien to von Harbo, and her inclination towards both Nazism and pacifism was no doubt a point of severe internal debate. When she died in 1954, she continued to admire and keep photographs of both Adolf Hitler and Mahatma Gandhi. Fundamentally, when critics label Metropolis as anti-socialist and point to the ending as an example of the placation of the working class, they not only dismiss the valid arguments supporting the contrary, they prove themselves blind to them, instead content to judge a film by a frame and how they interpret its sincerity.